All right, welcome to Cwic Show. My name is Greg Mattson. I'm your host. In this episode, I want to talk about the primary reason that people are leaving the church today in the United States and in the West, but primarily in the United States. It's not what most people think it is. And over again, I see a lot of apologetics in the church, those that are defending the doctrine in the church, etc., focused on church history and focused on atheism and evolution and these different things. And it's not like those things aren't a part of the problem, depending on your take on evolution, but it's not the primary issue anymore. It's not the CES letter that is the problem. It used to be up until recently, 5-10 years ago. That was the primary reason, right? It's looking at issues of church history and what I would call things that are of the lower law, historical issues, scientific issues. And that's still where apologetics is primarily focused on, atheism, and these different secular issues that are not, they're not what are capturing the hearts and minds, especially of the 18 to 30-year-olds, but everybody in the church. The problem with today is the ideology of identitarianism. It is critical social justice. So I kind of look at this in a way, if you follow the podcast, you know that I've talked a lot about the higher and the lower laws, especially on the gospel side of things. And the lower law is the carnal law, right? The lower law is the law of commandments, the checklists. It is the Aaronic priesthood. And that's how I look at the issue of science and atheism, evolution, church history, archaeology, DNA for Book of Mormon, where the Book of Mormon people come from, all of those types of things. That to me is the lower law. And I think those things have been very effective up to now in kind of softening the underbelly of people's testimonies and of a collective understanding of what the church is about and the gospel and the message of the restoration, right? Joseph Smith, called as a prophet, has the first vision, priesthood restored, ordinances restored, etc. But today, the real attack is a higher law attack. It is more spiritual in nature. That is, it is ideological. It is not something that comes in and you say, oh, well, I'm not sure about this Book of Abraham thing. How was it translated? What papyrus was used? And what about the characters that are written down and the facsimiles? Those are things that can certainly enter a bit of doubt into someone's mind if they don't have it in context. Because really, it's just a matter of context. But today, it's not just a matter of doubt. It's a matter of wholesale hearts and minds that are being moved from a gospel-centered principle of what we can call the doctrine of Christ. You know that I have a little bit of a different take on looking at the doctrine of Christ and what that means. But it's the doctrine of Christ that is being removed and being replaced with something very different. An ideology that is focused in on a Marxian tenets, right? Critical theory, which is divisive and breaks down everything. It pulls things down and breaks them apart, including your own identity, including families. And so once your mind starts to work in a different manner, and your heart is affected through different lenses that you see the world through, now you've got a real issue. It is your whole heart and mind that begins to change, not just some doubt about Joseph Smith or Brigham Young. That, again, if enough work is put into that, you can resolve that doubt. This is very different. And yet the apologetics in the church are still focused on these old things. And not that it's not important, it is important, because they still act as for those individuals whose hearts and minds begin to change through this ideology of critical social justice and identitarianism, then they do pull in things like the CES letter and these lower law issues that become a support to them in breaking down their testimony and turning the church into the oppressor. That's really what it becomes. And a good example of this is, it used to be that church history, as an example of critics of the church, right, would focus on Book of Abraham, Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, polygamy, all of these issues in church history. Those issues have now changed in how we look at them and how the critics look at them. Primarily, the issue is not polygamy itself, but it's misogyny and sexism, right? It is not the history just of the blacks in the priesthood. It is racism, right? So you have misogyny, sexism, racism. These are now the filters that are used for church history, not the actual history itself necessarily, which does right? It is under there, but it's the identitarian issues that are front and center. Because what changes here, why it's so much more powerful than just an issue of church history, a doubt in church history, is because it not only puts a doubt, it's not just a doubt that gets put in your mind, it's your whole idea of what the church is. It becomes an oppressor. It's a bunch of old white men, right? Again, identitarianism. It's a bunch of old white, sexist, misogynist men that are leading the church today and have led the church in the past. And so now your whole filter and your worldview has entered in on the church. And it's very difficult to stay away from this. When critical social justice enters into a younger mind, for example, it's a matter of weeks or months before these teachings of, men versus women and class versus class and race versus race, where there's always an oppressor and a victim. It's just a matter of time before that turns to the church. And the church becomes the oppressor. This is critical theory. This is happening all over the place in the church, and yet we're not doing anything about it. The apologetics are so lax in this ideology. It's very frustrating. They either don't want to do it and they're afraid to do it, which tells you something, or they're completely clueless on what is really happening out there. And it's concerning because it's happening everywhere, right? It's happening everywhere. And it's not just the church and the priesthood and the prophets where this is happening. It's now coming to the scriptures. We're going to do something on this very shortly. It is for many, they are not going to recognize the Book of Mormon once these filters are put over them. You will see it very differently. Some will see it very differently. And if you're caught up into critical theory and you're caught up into critical social justice, you're going to have a very hard time finding the spirit in the Book of Mormon. And that's where things are headed in academia right now. Now, I want to go over this a little bit and talk about the identitarianism issue with the family. That this is really important to understand, because the ideology is focused not just on the individual, but on the family. And so when you look at roles within a family, and I don't mean just gender roles, I'm just talking about your own individual identity as a man, your own individual identity as a woman, your own individual identity as a child, or a son or daughter, and then a father or a mother. Identitarianism, intersectionality, right? Critical race theory applied to everything is breaking those roles down. It's taking those roles and tearing them apart through identitarianism. And this is really important because it is it is the focus of the building unit of not just society, but of the church. And when you start pulling that apart, traditional family gets looked at very, very differently. And this may not be something that you're aware of yet, but this is growing. And it's growing in the church. And so as you look at the family, a traditional family, and you have all those warm, fuzzy feelings about that, or lack of that because you want it and you don't have it, the idea here with identitarianism is to change that thought process, to liberate you from the family, to liberate you from marriage, and to let you express yourself sexually with your sexual orientation, your sexual identity, whatever that might be, your gender fluidity, and remove all of the social norms and social constructs, right? This is a very strong tenet of critical social justice. Remove all of the social constructs of gender and family and et cetera, and pull the shackles of these things off of you and liberate you. This is the movement going all the way back to Hegel and up through Marx and Marcuse and et cetera, right? It's all the same thing. It's liberation over, quite frankly, the iron rod and the covenant path. You'll see, if you haven't seen it already, you'll see a lot of those, especially in academia, but a lot of individuals start talking about the covenant path as something that is oppressive. It's locking you in, right? And the idea that you are locked into these covenants is completely against the idea of liberation and social justice. Okay, so family is a key issue on this, and I'm going to go into that a little bit as we go into the Book of Mormon here. Just going to dip into a couple of different verses here. I also find it very interesting. I get a lot of feedback from listeners on and others on, as I go through social media, on parents reacting to their kids. There's this odd generation gap where some parents, unfortunately, very unfortunately, get this information that they're not aware of from their kids, right? Their teenage kids, for example. And then for some reason, there is this trust by these, not all parents, it's a smaller number, but this trust that is placed now in the kids and this new information about a new age, a postmodern way of thought. And they put this trust in on their kids instead of on the principles of the gospel that they have been given. And they unfound themselves, they unanchor themselves from some of these principles and react to the information that the kids give them, that they're getting from social media, from their schools, from their professors. It's a very odd dynamic. And it's very concerning. And I'm sure you've seen this as you've perused the pages of social media, the accounts of social media of your friends and family, and you watch this happen. And it's almost like if you've read Jonathan Haidt and the way he talks about safetyism and the way, unfortunately, that the U.S. parenting model has moved from developing your kids, let them grow up, let them face adversity, help them to overcome it, love them, put your arms around them, but don't hover over them and worry about every little problem they might face. Where we have moved toward that, it's almost like as they start learning some of this information about critical social justice, these Marxian tenets, that these parents are still into the safetyism. Right? The safety of their kids in a way, the helicoptering over their parents. It's like, oh, I need to protect them. They are right. I can't tell them they're wrong. I'm going to accept what they're saying and continue the safetyism blanket, the safetyism blanket that's put over their ideology that they are now adopting. And that's not the way to run a civilization. right? It should be the other way around, because eternal principles are always there. And if you're founded on eternal principles, then you want the kids to learn those eternal principles. You don't use safetyism, watching over the kids, as an excuse or a way to start bringing in new tenets of belief and new worldviews. This whole one of the things that we hear about now in apologetics, which has a lot of truth to it, is the idea of expressive individualism. And so you can go back to Charles Taylor, the philosopher Charles Taylor, and Carl Trueman, who's out talking from a Christian standpoint. Within the church, there's Jeffrey Thain and others that talk a lot about expressive individualism, which is basically, again, it's the idea of throwing off the shackles. It's liberation. And I'm just, what's most important to me is my truth, to live my own truth. But I think we need to back up a little bit and look at a broader panoramic view of this. Expressive individualism is not individualism. It is collectivism. And so when someone decides they want to go out and get blue hair, which I don't care about, I did something to my hair when I was a teenager in early 20s. But the idea that is expressing your individualism is not true, because everybody else is doing the same thing. Or if I'm going to like something because they put their pronouns in their profile, or put up some kind of a woke type of virtue signaling on social media, and I'm going to agree with it, that is not supporting expressive individualism. That's supporting collectivism. When you think about Lehi's dream and the great and spacious building, if you are there partaking of the fruit of the tree of life, the gospel, the doctrine of Christ, and you hear the shaming and the mocking and the pointed fingers at you, right? It may be that there is one person specifically that affects you a lot, but it is a whole building full of people in the same exact movement. It is a collective. It is a hive. And so expressive individualism is a farce. It is a ploy to go and say, I'm going to say that you get to be you. You be you. You live your life, which you see all the advertising slogans today are, it's all about you. But really it's not, is it? It's ultimately about the other side. It's ultimately about the hive and the pointed fingers as a collective that sit in the great and spacious building. So I think that's an important thing to consider. Take a step back, look at the panoramic view of that, and understand that those that think they're going into an individual, I'm now going to be bisexual. I'm now going to be, I'm going to change my pronouns, or whatever that might be. And I'm not saying you don't have certain feelings toward that. That's not what I'm saying. But what is happening is a social contagion to a large degree with women, especially, and young women. It is a social contagion that is not about them being an individual and unique. It's the opposite. It's about being approved of, right? It's about social pressure, peer pressure. It's about support from a group that says that it's all about you. Of course, when you go against the group and their tenets, as is always the case with Marxian tenets, then you're in real trouble. And that's when you really learn, or should learn, it's not about me being an individual. It's not about expressive individualism. It's about expressive collectivism. Okay. Now, lastly, I want to go into just a couple of verses here that I think are important. And we're going to start talking about this a lot more. I've had this on my mind for a while. I have gone over this previously, but it's time to really start launching into this a lot more. I want to go to Mosiah 12:8. And I just wanted just a couple of quick examples of how the Book of Mormon plays out today and how we need to learn its lessons and how the philosophies of men today that are swaying everyone and capturing hearts and minds is not new. The same tenets, the same ideas, oppressor versus victim, are all in the Book of Mormon. And we're going to go through this a lot more. But first, Mosiah 12:8. Yet they shall leave a record. This is Abinadi talking to, preaching to the people in the land of Nephi with King Noah and the priests. Yet they shall leave a record behind them. This is about the people of the Book of Mormon. And I will preserve them for other nations. That's like the United States and everyone else, which shall possess the land. Yea, even this will I do, that I may discover the abominations of this people to other nations, other peoples. So what Abinadi is saying there, look, I'm going to destroy this people one way or the other. And they're going to disintegrate into ites, and I'm going to destroy the people, the Nephites. But we're going to keep a record. We're going to preserve this record so that others can learn why this people failed, what they did, how they fell apart. We're going to focus a lot more on that. And then I want to go into Alma 48:24. This is, 48:10 first. This is Captain Moroni. We're going to talk about him a lot more and what's going on with him. This is oftentimes now today. It used to be Captain Moroni was this big hero, right? Today he's kind of poo-pooed a little bit, right? Because, we don't want to get too nationalistic. We don't want to, he was out fighting with a sword. We don't want to be violent, all these different things. But when we do that, when we dismiss him, we are dismissing the principles behind what he is teaching and what brings him to action. And we can't do that because it is the core. It is the center part of the Book of Mormon. In fact, Mormon, who compiles the Book of Mormon, is so infatuated with Captain Moroni that he names his son after him, right? Moroni, in the end. So Alma 48:10, and thus he was preparing to support their liberty. This is Captain Moroni. Support their liberty, this is key, their lands, their wives and their children, their families, and their peace, that they might live unto the Lord their God, and that they might maintain that which was called, this is key, that which was called by their enemies the cause of Christians. What a lot of people don't understand about the Book of Mormon, and it's not talked about nearly enough, this is part of what we're doing, is all of the dissenters. We need to look at, the book is not just about the Lamanites and the Nephites, these two different groups. It's the dynamic really is much more about the dissenters from the Nephites. Why they dissent. They're the ones that are the most vitriolic toward the Nephites and toward Christianity. And where do they go? Every group, the Amlicites or Amalekites, the Amalekites, the Amalekiahites, the Kingmen, the Zoramites, where do they go? They all go to the Lamanites. Okay? They have different sects. They're all still religious. They are all still religious. They have their churches and synagogues, their feasts, their rituals. But they're not Christian. We can bring in King Noah and his priests as well. Same thing. They deny the existence and the prophecies of Jehovah being born to a woman and taking on the sins of the world. It's really important to see that. And if you watch Mormon go through this, and this is part of why I think he names his son Moroni, because in the story of Moroni, you see especially although it's throughout the Book of Mormon, you especially see this coupling of liberty and Christianity. Those two go hand in hand. And he brings that through the whole story of the Book of Mormon over and over again. It's almost as if when you go down the road of removing liberty piece by piece, what's sitting down there at the end, the fundamental tenet, the fundamental principle under that liberty and everything else is the atoning sacrifice of Jesus Christ. And so as you remove these layers of liberty, you eventually get down to Jesus Christ. And they're not compatible anymore because the liberty is being removed. You're looking for a force of equity, right? You want to force the outcome. You want to go after the oppressors. And that has nothing to do with the doctrine of Christ. The doctrine of Christ is lowering yourself below others through charity. You're taking on their burdens, right? So all of the dissenters going away from the Nephites are anti-Christ. We get the examples in the Book of Mormon of those three antichrists, right? You have Sherem and Korihor and Nehor. You need to add every dissenter, every group that is a dissenter. And the number one antichrist that is in here is Nehor. It's not Korihor. When you've seen examples of people calling out someone else as a Korihor, that's not that big of a deal. Korihor was an atheist. And this is my whole point. That's not the problem. Atheism is, while it's an issue, and while it also is kind of at the end down there of secularism, that's not what draws people away. There are a small minority of people that end up going directly to atheism as being drawn away from the church. Not that it doesn't happen, it does, but it's not the main issue. What is the problem? What does the Book of Mormon tell us? The Book of Mormon tells us that Nehorism, which is not just priestcraft, it's a whole way of life. It is fighting against the oppressors. It is changing the doctrine of Christ from a savior theology to a liberation theology. It is tweaking the entire plan of salvation and moving it into something more like what was presented by the opposite side in the war in heaven. And look how effective it was. Nehorism goes throughout the entire rest of the Book of Mormon after we get into the Book of Alma, right there, starting with Nehor and Amalekai, right? It runs rampant everywhere. That's the problem. Again, they are religious. This is the same problem that happens at the time of Lehi. The Jews at Jerusalem are religious. Maybe they're fanatical, but they are anti-Christ. They are anti-Son of God. And that's probably the camp that Laman and Lemuel fall into. And that's probably the whole story of the entire Book of Mormon, right from the get-go. Lehi, Sariah, Nephi and Sam on one side, and Laman and Lemuel on the other. And the dividing line is Christ. And if you look at what I believe the tree of life really means in Lehi's vision, being the doctrine of Christ, condescension, you notice that Laman and Lemuel don't go there. And in our minds, we think, very bumper sticker-like, and we think, well, they're not righteous, so they're not going toward it. Well, it's the doctrine of Christ. And they walk away from it. Okay? So this coupling of liberty and Christ are a major theme for Mormon, and we need to be careful because there are so many now in the church, unfortunately, that are kind of putting that story and things under the carpet a little bit, right? They're sweeping it under the rug. And you have to ask yourself, why don't you like the story? Why don't you like the story? Lastly here, Alma 48:24. This is later in the chapter with Captain Moroni. And it says here, nevertheless, they could not suffer to lay down their lives, that their wives and their children should be massacred, right, by the barbarous cruelty of those who were once their brethren. See, it's about the dissenters. Because the dissenters leave and they are always in charge of the Lamanites. Yea, and had dissented from their church. They had dissented from their church, the church of the Son of God, and had left them and had gone to destroy them by joining the Lamanites. That's what we need to start drawing from here and understanding what is it that is pulling people away from the church today. It is an ideology, right? Again, our belly has been softened up by these lower law issues of doubt with translation and church history and whatever else the critics of the church have tried to throw at us. But those arrows that have gone in there have softened up the belly for the entrance of what, 10, 20 years ago would have been, we would have all thought that's ridiculous. You're not going to bring Marxism in again. You're not going to bring equity and the gospel of equity in again. That's some fringe professors tried that in the 60s. It didn't really work. Well, those fringe professors never went away. And they spread their gospel of equity and the religion of academia throughout the universities across the country. And as we send all our kids through those universities, they get indoctrinated, many of them get indoctrinated into that religion, into that way of life, into that worldview and that ideology. So something to consider for you is understanding what might draw you away. What would capture your heart or mind today? And if you have loved ones and friends, the likelihood is, if they are starting to fall from the church or have already, is that it has more to do with the ideology than it does the lower law things. Thanks for listening.